Hello, this is Mr. Kim, and I will be talking about distance formula and midpoint formula on this video. So, let me just go to the notes here. If we're talking about distance formula, I hope you guys remember the map analogy that I used. I'm going to go dive into straight to the example. I give you any 2 points on the grid mark. So for example, let's say I give you 2 comma negative 1 and 6 negative 6 comma 0. All you have to do is take a look at the x's, and then you need to take the average between the two. So if you find the average, you always should know that you're going to add these two and then divide it by 2. And that's it. So the technical formula that the textbooks like to use is x1 plus x2 divided by 2. x1 notating the first x right here, x2 notating the second x right here. So if I were to add these two in this case, I will get 2 plus negative 6 divided by 2, which gives you negative 4 over 2, which equals negative 2. Now, please do not cancel out the 2's like that, because you also have to cancel this 2 out from the negative 6. It's not going to be the same when you just cancel these out and tell me that the answer is negative 6. I hope you guys don't ever make that mistake. You always must add these together first and then divide by 2 after. Now, that takes care of your x, and the y's will be the same way. y1 plus y2 over 2, the average between these two y's, which means it's going to be negative 1 plus 0 divided by 2, which gives you negative 1 over 2. Now, then your final answer would be that the midpoint would be negative 2, comma negative 1.2. Now, it's that simple. However, in the homework, you guys had something where they give you one of the endpoints. For example, let's say the endpoint is negative 9, comma 7. And then they gave you the midpoint, which was 10, comma negative 3. So something like this, when they do not ask you for the midpoint, instead they ask you what the other endpoint is. You just have to tweak a little bit, but the main process of it doesn't change. Remember, the formula for this is x1 plus x2 over 2. That's your midpoint coordinate for x, comma, y1 plus y2 over 2. So if we just take a look at the x's here, or visually what's happening is, consider this point at negative 9, comma 7, for example, and then there's another point here somewhere out there that I don't know. I'm going to call it x, comma y. And the midpoint between those two, they tell you that it's actually at 10, comma negative 3. So if I gave it to you like this, with these 2 points, then you still use the midpoint formula, negative 9 plus x, because this will be your x coordinate for the first one, that will be your x coordinate for the second one, and then you divide this by 2. Then you take this and you set it equal to 10 because that's your midpoint x coordinate. After this is going to be the algebra. You're going to multiply both of these side by 2 to get rid of this 2. Then it becomes negative 9 plus x equals 20. Add the 9 on both sides. Then it becomes x is equal to 29. When you're doing this, you must show all this work, because you can't just tell me that negative 9 plus x over 2 is equal to 10 and then suddenly go to x equals 29. I need to see that you multiplied it by 2 first of all, and then after that adding a 9 on both sides. All of this work has to be done. And then afterwards, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the y's, the 7 and the y. Now, the formula is still the same. 7 plus y over 2, and that will give you this little guy, negative 3. The math has to be shown. Multiply both sides by 2, cancel these out. 7 plus y equals negative 6. Subtract 7 on both sides, and you'll be left with y equals negative 13. After this, with these two, write down your final answer as a coordinate point. Because remember, a midpoint coordinate means that it has to be in a coordinate formation x, comma y. So, the midpoint is just the average of those two, which means you add these two coordinates together, x's together, y's together, just like how we did here and here. and then divide it by 2. It's that simple. When you take a look at the homework problems or any review problems, I really suggest you to just remember that it's the average of the 2 points, or you just memorize this formula. That formula is the key. And when you show the work, if you put that down, it will really help you out. Now, the second thing is that I want to talk about is the distance formula. Now, remember on the map of Manhattan example that I gave you, let's say like the Times Square was somewhere around here and like the McDonald's was somewhere here. Okay, this was Times Square. What we did was we counted how much distance this and this was, right? So suppose, let's say that the distance down this way was, I don't know, 17, and the distance to the right was 3. Then, because the distance to Times Square to McDonald's was like this, and you can see how this creates a right triangle. And because if I want to find this distance, then the length of this will be the length of the hypotenuse of that triangle. And a right triangle, you guys already know, the Pythagorean Theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So if I wanted to find out this little red x, the distance that it takes somebody to go from Times Square to the McDonald's, you take a look at the 17 and 3 and go, oh, those are your a values and those are your b values. And this x will be your c value because c will always be your longest side or your hypotenuse. So all you got to do is plug it in. 17 squared plus 3 squared equals x squared, or c squared if you prefer that. Now 17 squared, let's see, what is 17 times 17? 9, 4, 11, 7, 0. So it's going to be 289 plus 9 is equal to x squared. Then you add these two, you get 298 is equal to x squared. And then so the x would be square root of 298. If you leave your answer like this, that's perfectly okay. Because we can't compute this off the top of our head. We have to use calculator. But rather than giving me some, the decimal points, just leave it like this in a square root form. That's perfectly fine. Now, for this right here, probably some of you guys will ask me, can you put 3 squared first? Yes, you can. It doesn't matter which one you call it as A or B, because in the end, you're still going to get 289 plus 9 or 9 plus 289 anyways. It doesn't matter which way it comes first. A plus B is same thing as saying B plus A, right? So, the length of hypotenuse, the Pythagorean theorem is basically what you use to solve for the distance formula. So, for the distance formula, there were some couple of hard questions on the homework that I want to go over. Mainly, there's 2 of them. If I give you 2 coordinates, I think you should be able to solve it pretty simply. So let me do an example. 10, 1 and 9, -4. Now, before here, I gave you a diagram on the map, and it was very easy for you to follow visually. But if I just gave you points like this, now I asked kids to plot those on the grid mark. So let's say this is 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, -4, that's a point, and then 10, 1, and then you'll be able to figure out the distances like that and draw yourself a right triangle. Or you can see that the distance that it takes you to go from this point to this point downwards will be the same thing as taking a look at your y value, -4 and 1, and subtract them. Because this y value, it tells you how like what the height is of that point, which is at 1. This point right here is at a height of -4. So if you think about it in terms of the level wise, in terms of height wise, it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 down, but that's also the same thing as saying 1 minus -4. So if you were to subtract these two, the y values together, it actually gives you the distance. So the formula is y2 minus y1. That tells you the distance, vertical height or vertical distance. same goes for x. This is your x coordinate here, which is at positive 9. This coordinate right here is at positive 10. So if you were to subtract them, you get a 1. And lo and behold, the distance from that point to that point horizontally is 1. So x2 minus x1 is the horizontal distance. And so what do we do with these two? We use the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, yes? Consider this as a, consider this as b. It doesn't matter which one you pick first. x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared is equal to c squared. So c means distance. So instead of calling it c, let's call it d to make it distance here. Now the final step is to just square root both sides to cancel this out, right? Because there's a little square guy here that I want to get rid of. I want to get distance completely by itself. And so the technical, mathematical, textbook formula that they throw at you is this. Now this may look complicated, but the origin or the idea, the big idea came from where it came from is just Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Visually, we have seen that from Times Square to McDonald's, the distance this way, square those, add them up, and square root them. And you ended up with x equals 298. Now, even if you were to use the same idea here with just the letters, that's what it just becomes. Okay, so the distance technical formula is this. So if you were to write this down, that would be great on your quizzes and tests. Make it more constructive and show your work based on this formula. Now let's actually test this to see if it works. The example above that I gave you was 10, 1 and 9, negative 4. So what am I going to do? I am going to take this point as the second point, this point as your first point, and so this right here will be your y2, this will be your x2, notating the 2's as the second point. This will be your y coordinate of the first one, this will be your x coordinate of the first one. Now I have all that labeled out, so now let's go back to the formula. So I'm going to take x2 minus x1 squared plus y2, which is negative 4, minus y1, which is 1 squared, and then you square root the whole thing, and that is equal to d. Now 9 minus 10 is negative 1 squared, plus negative 5 squared, because that's what negative 4 minus 1 is going to be, and you square root that gives you the distance. So 1 plus 25 square root of 26 is the distance. Now, if you were to visually graph this out like I did here, you would still get the same thing. Just the distance is 5, distance is 1. So the formula that I used here gives you the same result. So the final answer would be root 26 is equal to d. This is how you'll be able to find the distance whenever you're given two coordinates here. Okay, so this should be in your notes. Have to write this down. It's not something I gave you constructively during the class. The final question that I want to go over is some of the critical thinking questions on your homework that a lot of you guys have missed. Now, question 25 on the homework says, name a point that is root 2 away from negative 1, 5, for example. And 26 says, name a point that is between 50 and 60 units away from 7, negative 2. Now, again, from the midpoint, where this was a little challenging, this question right here, because we are so used to be given the two coordinates and then just solving for the midpoint. But however, if I give you the midpoint and one of the endpoints and I ask you for the other endpoint, then it just changes the game. But the main idea of it does not change. The formula, applying it, that doesn't change at all. So here, it's the same deal. For this one, the distance has to be root 2. That's what it's saying. So if you think about it, negative 1, positive 5, the point will be right up here. Now, when I explained this to some of the kids who asked me the first time, all I said was, okay, if you just really think about it, a root 2 away from this point technically means that I can go root 2 this way, like that, and there's your answer right there. Right? Technically, the distance between these 2 points should be root 2. So what do? I take this, negative 1 comma 5, and then because I'm moving horizontally positive root 2 amount, all I have to do is take my x-coordinate, negative 1, and you add the root 2 to it. I'm going to mark that in red just so that you can see it better. Plus root 2, comma, your y value is just going to be 5 because you didn't move any units up or down. You didn't do any of that. So it's just still the same as the original, but your x-coordinate is the only one that's changing. That is your potential one answer that you can find. Another answer is you can go up by root 2, which means it's going to be negative 1, comma, because you didn't move left or right, but the 5 will be added by root 2. It's that simple. Same thing here, you move it to the west. Negative 1 minus root 2, comma 5. Go to minus 2 on the red, because you're moving it to the left, so it's the negative direction. If you move it down, it's going to be negative 1, comma, 5 minus root 2. Mark that in red. Okay? Now, if you don't have those four answers, any of those four answers, that means that you might have some point around here that still gives you the same distance, that's root 2. So what do we really have here? All of these outskirts of the points should create what we call a circle, because from the center, if we move away root 2, and if you think about that as a radius, then what we have is basically a circle, right? So your answer technically could be those 4 points. But in order to figure out any of these points there, then what we have to do is we just have to use the distance formula, right? So let's say that there is some point here that exists x comma y. That could be here, here, anywhere that's labeled it as x comma y because I don't know where it's going to be. You use the distance formula. What was it again? x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. The whole thing square rooted is the distance. So this point right here is negative 1 comma 5. I'm going to use that as my first point. So I'm going to use this one as my second point, which means this is your y2, this is your y1. My center coordinate was at negative 1 comma 5, and I'm going to call this y2. I'm sorry, this is x1, like x2. I'm sorry, and that is x. Whoa, I made a lot of mistakes here. y1 and x1. So once I labeled all of that, please label all of these so you don't get confused as to which one that you were using as the second or the first. y2, y1, so and x2 minus x1. So let me just use this one first. x2 it just says x, right? Because that's what it says right here. And then minus x1 is just minus negative 1 because that's this guy. The whole thing squared plus y2, which is just y, which is that, minus 5 squared. And you square root the whole thing and that becomes your distance. So this right here becomes x plus 1 squared plus y minus 5 squared, and you square root that and it becomes the distance. So technically, this right here will be more appropriate way of writing the answer. The distance here, I'm going to plug it in as just root 2, right? So if I just do the math here, and I square both sides, because I want to get rid of the square roots. This and this cancels out, this and this cancels out. X plus 1 squared plus y minus 5 squared equals 2. And then you would say any x comma y that goes in the equation above. This would be the complete answer to the question 25. Now this may seem crazy. Am I going to give you this on the quiz or test? No. This is for your guidance. We're going to talk about how this right here, you'll probably be able to talking about this in late, I don't know, March, April. It's called equation of circles. It will look a lot similar to this. Distance formula, it builds upon to what we call equations of circles, and we're going to do circles later down the year. But any of these 4 points we talked about in the beginning will do. Okay? And the same thing applies to the question 26 because 26 says distance between 50 and 60. So you can literally choose 50, 51, 60. But I mean, why even bother to choose this point? I mean, the easiest one to probably use is 50, right? So just use 50. It's the same exact problem. So instead of having root 2, you're going to say the distance is 50. Instead of saying your point is negative 1 comma 5, you're going to say it's 7 negative 2. And then I would like you to write down your answer. You could go north, west, south, east. Get those 4 points and pick one of those points as your answer. That's your answer. Or if you wanted to challenge yourself, try to create this circle equation, just like how I did here, for question 50. It should be doable. Do not change your distance, just pick one distance to do it, because if you change it midway, it's not going to be possible. Okay? This should summarize this lesson. So, midpoint, I'm going to give you the textbook definition, even though I really don't like to give you those. That's your midpoint formula. And the distance formula is d is equal to square root of y2 minus y1 squared plus x2 minus x1 squared. I keep switching these orders for some reason, but it doesn't really matter, guys. You can put the x first, y first, it doesn't matter. Just remember it's very similar to looking like a slope, right? y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. So these put in like here, and then you just like squaring it, adding them up, and square rooting it. That will be your distance formula. Okay? So, hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll talk to you guys soon.